Lieutenant Rebecca Strongheart dropped her radio mid-transmission, her weathered hand frozen inches from her holster as the massive shadow filled the doorway of Millfield Police Station. The autumn wind howled through the open door, but it wasn't the cold that made her blood freeze. It was the sight of 180 kilograms of raw muscle and fur stepping deliberately across the threshold. This wasn't supposed to happen. Wild bears don't walk into police stations and gently close doors behind them. Officer Martinez stumbled backward, his chair clattering to the floor as he scrambled for his weapon. The coffee pot shattered against linoleum. Dispatcher Sarah's scream died in her throat as the enormous black bear rose onto his hind legs, towering 8 feet tall, and pressed his massive paws together in what looked impossibly like prayer. Rebecca's mind flashed to her daughter Emma, who used to make that same gesture during bedtime prayers, 3 years before the leukemia took her away. "Nobody move," she whispered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. What did this creature want, and why did his dark eyes hold such desperate, human-like intelligence? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The bear lowered himself slowly to all fours, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, as if he understood the terror radiating from every human in the room. Rebecca had seen plenty of wildlife encounters in her 15 years of law enforcement, but nothing like this. Bears didn't behave this way. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't seem to think. Millfield, Montana, had always been a town that time forgot. Once home to 15,000 souls when the lumber mills ran 3 shifts, now barely 2,800 residents clung to life in the shadow of the Glacier National Forest. Main Street looked like a mouth missing half its teeth. Empty storefronts with soap-streaked windows, rusted for-lease signs swaying in the mountain wind. The police station itself was a converted auto garage from the 1960s, cramped and understaffed, serving a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Rebecca Strongheart had fled here 3 years ago, carrying the weight of her daughter's death like stones in her pockets. Emma had been 8 when the leukemia finally won, and Rebecca's marriage hadn't survived the aftermath. Her Cherokee grandmother used to say that some people run toward their pain, others run away from it. Rebecca had chosen the latter, trading her detective badge in Billings for this quiet corner of nowhere, where she could nurse her wounds in peace. The bear, she could see now it was a male, massive but oddly gentle, limped slightly on his back left paw. Old injury, she noted professionally. His fur was thick and healthy despite the missing appendage, suggesting he'd adapted well to his disability. More importantly, his behavior remained calm, almost purposeful. "Martinez, put your weapon away," she ordered softly. "Sarah, cancel that emergency call. Nobody makes any sudden movements." The bear's ears twitched at her voice. He turned his enormous head toward her, and Rebecca felt something shift in her chest. Those eyes, dark brown, almost black, held an intelligence that made her skin prickle. This wasn't just an animal following instinct. This was a creature trying to communicate. Officer Martinez, 24 years old and fresh from the academy, kept his service pistol trained on the bear. "Lieutenant, protocol says—" "Protocol doesn't cover this," Rebecca cut him off. Her own weapon remained holstered. Something deep in her gut, the same instinct that had kept her alive during domestic violence calls and late-night traffic stops, told her this bear wasn't a threat. He was asking for help. The massive animal padded across the worn linoleum, his claws clicking softly with each step. He approached Rebecca's desk with the careful precision of someone who understood boundaries. When he reached her, he sat back on his haunches and again pressed his front paws together, his head tilted slightly upward. The gesture was unmistakably human, unmistakably desperate. "What do you want, big guy?" Rebecca whispered, her hand slowly extending toward him. The bear's response to Rebecca's outstretched hand was unlike anything she'd witnessed in her wildlife training. Instead of backing away or showing aggression, he gently nudged her palm with his massive snout, then turned toward the door. He took 3 deliberate steps, stopped, and looked back over his shoulder with an expression that could only be described as urgent invitation. "He wants us to follow him," Rebecca said, the words sounding absurd even as they left her lips. Martinez lowered his weapon slightly but kept it ready. "Ma'am, that's insane. We can't follow a wild bear into the forest. It could be leading us into an ambush, or—" "Bears don't ambush humans, Martinez. They avoid us." Rebecca grabbed her jacket from the back of her chair, her mind racing through possibilities. In her father's Cherokee tradition, animals were messengers. Her rational, trained mind rejected such thinking, but her gut told her otherwise. "Sarah, radio dispatch?" "Tell them we're following up on a unusual wellness check." The bear seemed to understand her decision. He padded to the door, pushed it open with surprising gentleness, and waited. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Rebecca stepped outside, her breath visible in the crisp October air. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since morning, and the scent of approaching rain hung heavy in the atmosphere. "At least take backup," Martinez pleaded, following reluctantly. "You are my backup, but keep your weapon holstered unless I say otherwise." Rebecca's instincts had served her well for 15 years. She'd talked down armed suspects, navigated domestic disputes, and survived more dangerous situations than she cared to remember. This felt different, not threatening, but urgent. The bear began moving toward the forest with a peculiar gait. His injured back paw forced him to compensate, but he moved with determination and surprising speed. Every 50 yards he would stop and look back, ensuring the humans were following. His intelligence was undeniable now. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was purposeful communication. The trail led away from town toward the old logging roads that crisscrossed the national forest. Rebecca had patrolled these paths countless times, but always in daylight, always with backup, and never following a bear with apparent cognitive abilities. The forest grew denser with each step, towering pines and firs creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. "Lieutenant," Martinez whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "My wife is going to kill me if she finds out about this." Despite the tension, Rebecca almost smiled. Martinez had married his high school sweetheart 6 months ago, a petite nurse at the county hospital who worried constantly about her husband's safety. "Let's focus on getting home to tell her about it." The bear continued his steady pace, occasionally pausing to sniff the air or adjust his direction slightly. After 45 minutes of hiking, Rebecca's radio crackled to life. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. What's your status?" She keyed the microphone. "Still investigating. We'll report back within the hour." "Copy that. Weather Service is calling for possible storms this evening. Be advised." The bear's ears perked up at the radio chatter, and he quickened his pace noticeably. Whatever emergency had driven him to seek human help was becoming more urgent with time. They emerged into a small clearing where an old logging road intersected with a barely visible trail. The bear took the narrower path without hesitation, leading them deeper into wilderness territory. Rebecca checked her GPS unit. They were roughly 8 miles from town, approaching the boundary between state and private land. The scent of wood smoke reached them first, carried on the changing wind. Then, through the trees, Rebecca spotted the weathered roof of a log cabin. The structure was small but well-maintained, with a stone chimney from which a thin trail of smoke emerged. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested, stretched along the cabin's south side. This wasn't some abandoned hunting lodge. Someone lived here. The bear stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face Rebecca and Martinez. His behavior shifted dramatically. The calm, purposeful demeanor was replaced by visible agitation. He paced in a small circle, whined softly, then approached the cabin's front door. Standing on his hind legs, he began pawing at the wooden surface, his claws scraping against the weathered planks. "Jesus Christ," Martinez breathed. "He's trying to get inside." Rebecca's training kicked in. Domestic welfare check protocols were clear, but this situation defied every manual she'd ever studied. She approached the cabin cautiously, noting the silence within despite the smoking chimney. No sounds of television, radio, or human activity. The windows were curtained, revealing nothing of the interior. She knocked firmly on the door. "Hello? This is Lieutenant Strongheart with Millfield Police. Is anyone home? We're here to check on your welfare." Silence. The bear's agitation increased. He dropped to all fours and began pacing frantically between the door and the humans, his distress palpable. Rebecca tried the door handle, locked. She peered through a gap in the curtains and saw warm lamplight illuminating a cozy living room with handmade quilts and family photographs covering the walls. The bear's whining grew more insistent as he began scratching at the door with both front paws. "Police! We're coming in!" Rebecca announced, then tested her shoulder against the doorframe. The old wood gave way with a sharp crack, and she stumbled into the cabin with Martinez close behind. The scene that greeted them defied every expectation. An elderly woman lay unconscious on the braided rug in front of a stone fireplace, her silver hair spread around her head like a halo. But that wasn't what stopped Rebecca cold. It was the sound. Children crying somewhere deeper in the cabin. "Call for an ambulance," Rebecca ordered Martinez, dropping to her knees beside the woman. The elderly lady was breathing but unconscious, her pulse weak and irregular. "Diabetic emergency," Rebecca guessed, noting the medical alert bracelet on her wrist. "And back up. We've got children here." The bear pushed past them both, moving through the cabin with obvious familiarity. His distressed whining echoed from what appeared to be bedrooms at the back of the house. Rebecca followed the sound and discovered something that would haunt every subsequent report she'd have to write. 3 children huddled together on a twin bed in a small, cheerfully decorated bedroom. A girl who appeared to be around 12 was holding 2 younger children, a boy and a much smaller girl, as all 3 sobbed quietly. Their faces showed fear, but not the terror she'd expect from children encountering strangers. They were clean, well-dressed, and obviously cared for. "It's okay," Rebecca said softly, holstering her weapon and raising her hands peacefully. "I'm a police officer. We're here to help. What are your names?" The oldest girl looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Are you here because of Grandma Ellie? Kodiak went to get help. He's been gone for hours. We were so scared." Rebecca's mind reeled. Grandma Ellie? Kodiak? The bear had a name? "The lady in the living room, Ellie. Is she your grandmother?" "Not really," the girl whispered. "But she takes care of us. She saved us when nobody else would." She gestured toward the bear, who had positioned himself protectively between the children and the door. "Kodiak is our protector. He won't hurt you unless you try to hurt us." Martinez appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Ambulance is 15 minutes out. Rebecca, we've got a problem. I ran the address through dispatch. This property belongs to Eleanor Whitmore, 72 years old, retired Army nurse, no record of legal guardianship for any children." The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Whatever was happening here, 3 children living with an elderly woman and a bear, wasn't legal. Child Protective Services would have to be contacted immediately. The children would be removed. The bear would likely be destroyed as a public safety threat. "Please don't take us away," the oldest girl pleaded. reading Rebecca's expression with heartbreaking accuracy. "We don't have anywhere else to go. Grandma Ellie is the only family we have." The middle child, a boy who appeared to be around 9, hadn't spoken at all. He rocked slightly back and forth, his hands covering his ears, classic signs of autism or sensory processing disorder. The smallest girl, maybe 7 years old, clutched a stuffed bear that looked remarkably similar to their massive guardian. Rebecca knelt beside the bed, her voice gentle. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "I'm Lily," the oldest said. "This is Marcus and Sophie. We've lived here for 2 years. Grandma Ellie homeschools us and teaches us about gardening and cooking and how to live in the forest. Kodiak helps, too. He can carry water buckets and knows how to fetch medicine if someone gets sick." "Where are your parents?" Rebecca asked, though she dreaded the answer. Lily's face crumpled. "Dead, all of them. Car accident, overdose, COVID. We all lost everybody. The foster homes were—" She shuddered. "Grandma Ellie found us when we had nowhere to go. She says God sends angels in all different forms, and sometimes they have 4 paws instead of wings." Martinez cleared his throat from the doorway. "Lieutenant, I need to speak with you privately." Rebecca stepped into the hallway, leaving the children with their unusual guardian. Martinez looked deeply uncomfortable. "I called it in like you said, but dispatch wants to know about the bear. Animal control is being contacted. There's also a mandatory reporting requirement for the children. CPS has to be notified within the hour." "I know the protocols," Rebecca said sharply, then softened her tone. "But look at them, Martinez. They're not abused or neglected. They're terrified of being separated. Doesn't matter. The law is clear. Unlicensed guardianship, dangerous animal on the premises, potential endangerment. We don't have choices here." The sound of approaching sirens broke through the forest quiet. Rebecca returned to the children, who pressed closer together at the noise. The bear, Kodiak, sensed their fear and moved protectively in front of the bed. "The paramedics are here to help your grandmother," Rebecca explained, "but there are going to be other people coming too. Social workers, people whose job it is to make sure children are safe." "They'll split us up," Lily whispered. "They always split up siblings. Marcus needs routine and quiet places, and Sophie has nightmares. We take care of each other here. Grandma Ellie taught us how." The paramedics burst through the front door with their equipment. Rebecca heard them working on Eleanor, calling out medical terminology and vital signs. Time was running out for more than just the elderly woman's life. "Lieutenant Strongheart," a paramedic called from the living room. "We need to transport immediately. Diabetic, ketoacidosis, possible cardiac involvement. She's critical." Rebecca looked at the 3 children and their bear guardian, knowing that in the next hour, this makeshift family would be torn apart by systems designed to protect them. She had to make a choice that would define not just her career, but the lives of 3 innocent children. The next 48 hours blurred together in a whirlwind of bureaucracy, heartbreak, and discoveries that would challenge everything Rebecca thought she knew about family, love, and the law. As Eleanor Whitmore was rushed to Glacier Regional Medical Center in critical condition, Rebecca found herself making a decision that could end her career. She declared the cabin an active crime scene, buying precious time before Child Protective Services could remove the children. "This is highly irregular, Lieutenant," said Janet Morrison, the CPS supervisor who arrived with 2 social workers and enough paperwork to relocate a small army. Janet was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. 3 minors living with an unlicensed guardian and a dangerous wild animal. We need to remove them immediately." Rebecca stood her ground in the cabin's living room, surrounded by evidence of a life lived with intention and love. Every surface told a story. Marcus's artwork, carefully framed and displayed, Sophie's reading awards from a homeschool program, Lily's science fair certificates. The refrigerator was covered with chore charts, medication schedules, and family photos showing the children, Eleanor and, yes, Kodiak, in various poses of domestic happiness. "I need 72 hours to complete my investigation," Rebecca insisted. "There are questions about how these children came to be here, their legal status, and potential criminal activity that brought them into Eleanor's care." It wasn't entirely a lie. Rebecca had spent the previous day diving deep into the children's backgrounds, and what she'd discovered painted a picture of systemic failure that made her physically sick. Each child had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Lily Chen Morrison's file was a nightmare of bureaucratic incompetence. Her parents had died in a car accident 18 months ago, struck by a drunk driver who turned out to be an employee of Brennan Development Corporation. The insurance settlement had been tied up in legal proceedings while Lily was shuffled between foster homes. The first placement had been with distant relatives who'd quickly realized they couldn't handle a grieving 12-year-old. The second had lasted 3 weeks before allegations of abuse had surfaced. The third foster father had tried to molest her. Lily had run away and lived on the streets for 2 months before Eleanor found her digging through dumpsters behind the Millfield grocery store. Marcus Thompson's story was equally heartbreaking. His parents had died in a COVID outbreak at the assisted living facility where they worked. His elderly grandparents had taken him in but couldn't cope with his autism spectrum needs. They'd surrendered him to the state with a note that simply read, "We can't handle him anymore. Please find someone who can." Marcus had been placed in a group home where his sensory processing issues were treated as behavioral problems. He'd stopped speaking entirely and had begun self-harming when Eleanor somehow managed to get temporary custody through legal channels that Rebecca was still trying to trace. 7-year-old Sophie Williams was perhaps the most tragic case. Both parents had died of COVID within a week of each other, leaving her completely alone. With no extended family and no one willing to adopt a traumatized child with severe attachment disorder, she'd become a ward of the state. 3 different placements had failed when her night terrors and separation anxiety proved too challenging for untrained foster families. Eleanor had taken Sophie as a last resort when all other options had been exhausted. The legal documentation Rebecca discovered in Eleanor's files was meticulous and surprisingly sophisticated. Eleanor had been working with a family attorney in Billings to navigate the adoption process for all 3 children. The paperwork showed that she'd undergone background checks, home studies, and psychological evaluations. Every requirement had been met except for one: the issue of Kodiak. "No adoption agency will approve a placement where there's a large predator on the property," Janet Morrison said dismissively when Rebecca presented the documents. "And frankly, I'm questioning the mental competency of any 72-year-old woman who thinks she can care for 3 special needs children and a bear." "These children aren't special needs," Rebecca shot back. "They're traumatized. There's a difference. And from what I can see, Eleanor was doing better than the system ever did." The bear in question had become something of a phenomenon in the 48 hours since his dramatic appearance at the police station. Dr. Sarah Running Bear, a wildlife biologist from the University of Montana, had driven down to assess Kodiak after word of the unusual situation spread through academic circles. Her initial examination revealed facts that challenged every assumption about wildlife behavior. "This animal has been extensively trained," Dr. Running Bear explained to the small crowd that had gathered in Eleanor's living room. "He responds to over 20 verbal commands, can perform complex tasks like opening doors and retrieving specific items, and shows clear evidence of emotional bonding with all 4 humans in this household. His behavior is unprecedented in my 30 years of studying bear-human interactions." Kodiak demonstrated his abilities as if he understood the stakes. When Marcus went into one of his sensory overload episodes triggered by the stress of strangers in the house, the bear immediately retrieved a weighted blanket from a bedroom closet and gently covered the boy. When Sophie began crying for Grandma Ellie, Kodiak positioned himself beside her and allowed her to bury her face in his fur while making soft, comforting sounds. "It's impossible," Janet Morrison muttered, watching the interactions with obvious discomfort. "Bears don't behave this way." "This bear does," Dr. Running Bear corrected. "Eleanor Whitmore has somehow achieved what most animal behaviorists would consider impossible. She's created a genuine interspecies family unit." Rebecca's investigation revealed more about Eleanor's background, and each new fact deepened her respect for the elderly woman fighting for her life in intensive care. Eleanor's military service record showed decorated service as a combat nurse in Vietnam, where she'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments treating wounded soldiers under fire. After the war, she'd married a Millfield police officer named James Whitmore and raised a son who'd followed his father into law enforcement. The tragedy that had shaped Eleanor's later life was documented in newspaper clippings Rebecca found in a hope chest beside Eleanor's bed. 25 years ago, James Whitmore had been killed in the line of duty during a domestic violence call. 6 months later, their son Michael, a Marine serving his second tour in Afghanistan, had died when his convoy hit an improvised explosive device. Eleanor had lost both her husband and her child within a year, leaving her completely alone at age 47. The local newspaper had followed Eleanor's story for several years after the deaths. She'd used her military survivor benefits and life insurance settlements to purchase the 40-acre property where she now lived, retreating from town life to heal in solitude. Neighbors reported seeing her occasionally at the grocery store or post office, but she'd become increasingly reclusive over the years. What no one knew until Rebecca's investigation was that Eleanor had been quietly rescuing people for decades. Financial records showed regular donations to veteran support organizations, homeless shelters, and children's charities. More significantly, Rebecca discovered that Eleanor had served as an emergency foster parent for over 20 children during the 1980s and 1990s, specializing in what social workers now called difficult placements, children with medical needs, behavioral challenges, or trauma histories that made them hard to place. "She was one of our best foster families," confirmed Patricia Hawk, a retired social worker who'd worked with Eleanor for years. "She had a gift with damaged kids. Some people can fix broken things. Eleanor could fix broken hearts. We stopped calling her when the liability insurance requirements changed." The state decided they couldn't cover placements with someone who lived so far from town. The discovery that hit Rebecca the hardest came in the form of a photograph tucked inside Eleanor's Bible. It showed a younger Eleanor, perhaps in her 50s, standing beside an angry-looking 12-year-old girl with dark hair and defiant eyes. On the back, Eleanor had written, "Rebecca Strongheart, age 12, October 1994. Angry at the world but ready to heal. 6 months later, adopted by the Martinez family. Now a police officer. Prayers answered." Rebecca stared at the photograph for a long time, struggling to reconcile the image with her fractured childhood memories. She remembered being 12, remembered the rage and grief after her parents' car accident, remembered the confusing months of being shuttled between relatives who couldn't or wouldn't take permanent custody. But she'd blocked out many details from that period, protecting herself from memories too painful to process. Slowly, fragments began returning. A cabin in the woods, an elderly woman with gentle hands and infinite patience, a garden where she'd learned to plant seeds and watch things grow. And yes, there had been animals, not a bear, but rescue dogs and cats, injured wildlife being nursed back to health, a place where broken things were made whole. Eleanor had saved her 30 years ago, and Rebecca had forgotten until now. The revelation came just as Eleanor's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the attending physician at Glacier Regional, called Rebecca with grim news. "Mrs. Whitmore has suffered a massive stroke," Dr. Hawkins explained over the phone. "Even if she survives, there will likely be significant cognitive impairment, memory loss, speech difficulties, possible paralysis. I'm sorry, Lieutenant, but you need to prepare those children. She may not be coming home." Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 children's futures pressing down on her shoulders. Janet Morrison had made it clear that without Eleanor, the children would be immediately removed and placed in separate foster homes. Kodiak would be relocated to a wildlife preserve if he was lucky. More likely, he'd be euthanized as a public safety threat. "There has to be another way," Rebecca whispered to Martinez as they stood outside Eleanor's hospital room, watching through the glass as machines kept her alive. "The law is pretty clear," Martinez said sadly. "Even if she recovers, she can't care for 3 children in her condition, and nobody else is going to take them as a group, especially not with the bear." As if summoned by their conversation, Kodiak appeared in the hospital corridor. Rebecca had no idea how the bear had managed to travel 8 miles from the cabin to the hospital, but there he was, limping determinedly down the hallway toward Eleanor's room. Nurses scattered, alarms began sounding, and security guards appeared with tranquilizer guns. "Wait!" Rebecca shouted, positioning herself between the armed guards and the bear. "He's not dangerous. He's trying to see Eleanor." "Ma'am, step away from the animal," the head of security ordered. "We have protocols for situations like this." But Kodiak had stopped moving. He sat in front of Eleanor's room, peering through the glass at the woman who had given him purpose and love. His massive frame shook with what could only be described as grief, and soft, whining sounds escaped his throat. For a moment, the entire hospital corridor fell silent. Doctors, nurses, security guards, and patients who had emerged from their rooms to watch the commotion all stood transfixed by the sight of a wild animal mourning a human. Dr. Hawkins, who had been treating Eleanor, approached slowly. She was a small woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. "In 40 years of medicine," she said quietly, "I've never seen anything like this. This animal loves her." "What happens to him when she dies?" Rebecca asked. "The same thing that happens to the children," Dr. Hawkins replied. "They get separated from the only family they've ever known." Rebecca looked at Kodiak, then at her own reflection in the hospital window. She saw a woman who had spent 3 years running from the pain of loss, hiding in a small town where she could avoid forming new attachments. She saw someone who had forgotten that sometimes the most broken families were also the strongest ones. And for the first time since Emma's death, she saw someone ready to fight for love instead of running from it. The courtroom in Glacier County was packed beyond capacity on the morning of November 15th. News crews from 3 states had descended on Millfield after word spread about the Bear Family Custody Case, as the media had dubbed it. Rebecca sat in the gallery behind the defense table, watching as 3 small children faced the most important moment of their young lives. Judge Margaret Clearwater, a stern-faced woman in her 60s who had presided over family court for 23 years, looked down at the assembled crowd with obvious displeasure. "This is a custody hearing, not a circus," she announced. "Anyone who cannot maintain courtroom decorum will be removed immediately." Janet Morrison sat at the prosecution table with 2 assistant district attorneys, her case files stacked in neat piles. She wore a dark navy suit and the confident expression of someone who had never lost a case like this. Across from her, Eleanor's attorney, David Crow Feather, looked considerably less confident. Eleanor remained in intensive care, unable to speak or advocate for herself, leaving her elderly lawyer to fight alone for a family that existed outside every legal precedent. The children sat in the front row with Rebecca, their small hands clasped tightly together. Lily wore the blue dress that Eleanor had bought her for church services they attended every Sunday. Marcus had insisted on wearing his lucky NASA t-shirt beneath a button-down shirt, and Sophie clutched the stuffed bear that never left her side. They looked impossibly small and vulnerable in the formal setting. Kodiak was not allowed in the courtroom, but Rebecca could see him through the window, sitting patiently in the back of Dr. Running Bear's research van. Even at this distance, his distress was obvious. He hadn't eaten in 3 days, and Dr. Running Bear reported that he spent most of his time staring in the direction of the hospital where Eleanor lay unconscious. "Your Honor," Janet Morrison began, rising from her chair with theatrical precision, "the state of Montana has a clear interest in protecting these 3 minor children from an obviously dangerous and illegal living situation. Eleanor Whitmore, despite whatever good intentions she may have had, was operating outside the law. She had no legal custody of these children, no license to care for them, and most egregiously she was exposing them daily to a wild predator that could have killed them at any moment." Janet paced in front of the judge's bench like a prosecutor in a murder trial. "The defendant will argue that these children were happy and well cared for. But happiness is not the standard by which we measure child welfare. Safety is. Legal guardianship is. Proper oversight and professional support services are." None of these requirements were met. She gestured toward a thick folder on her table. "I have documentation showing that all 3 children have significant trauma histories and special needs that require professional intervention. Marcus Thompson has autism spectrum disorder and requires specialized therapeutic services. Sophie Williams has attachment disorder stemming from the loss of both parents. Lily Chen Morrison has educational gaps from irregular schooling and emotional issues related to her experiences in multiple foster placements." Rebecca felt the children stiffen beside her as their most private struggles were laid bare in front of strangers. Lily's face flushed red with embarrassment, while Marcus began rocking slightly in his chair. Sophie pressed closer to Rebecca's side, seeking comfort. "Furthermore," Janet continued, "the presence of this bear, this wild animal that could maim or kill without warning, represents an unconscionable risk to these vulnerable children. I have expert testimony that will demonstrate the inherent danger of keeping a 180-kilogram predator in close proximity to minors." David Crow. Feather rose to present his opening statement, but Judge Clearwater held up a hand. "Before we proceed, I want to hear from the children themselves. In cases involving custody of minors over the age of 7, this court recognizes their right to express their preferences." Janet Morrison's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Your Honor, these children have been emotionally manipulated by their current situation. They may not be capable of making rational decisions about their own welfare." "That's for me to determine," Judge Clearwater replied curtly. "Lily Chen Morrison, please approach the bench." Lily walked to the witness stand on unsteady legs, her 12-year-old frame dwarfed by the formal surroundings. The court clerk administered the oath, and Lily's voice barely carried across the courtroom as she promised to tell the truth. "Lily," Judge Clearwater said gently, "I want you to tell me about your life with Ms. Whitmore. Take your time and speak loudly enough for everyone to hear." Lily looked out at the packed courtroom, her eyes finding Rebecca's face in the crowd. She straightened her shoulders, a gesture so reminiscent of Eleanor that several people in the gallery drew sharp breaths. "Your Honor, before I lived with Grandma Ellie, I thought families were just something that happened to other people. My real parents died in a car accident, and after that, I lived in 4 different foster homes in 6 months. At the first one, they kept me in the basement because I cried too much. At the second one, the foster dad tried to touch me in ways that weren't okay. The third family was nice, but they already had 5 kids and didn't have room for one more broken person. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. When I ran away, I lived on the streets for 2 months. I ate out of dumpsters and slept in doorways and thought about dying every single day. Then one night, when I was going through the garbage behind Miller's Market, Grandma Ellie found me. Janet Morrison started to object, but Judge Clearwater silenced her with a look. She didn't lecture me or threaten to call the police, Lily continued. She just said, "Child, you look hungry. Would you like some soup?" She took me home and ran me a hot bath and gave me clean clothes. She didn't ask where I'd been or why I'd run away. She just made me feel safe for the first time in months. Lily's voice began to crack with emotion. People say it's weird that we live with a bear, but Kodiak isn't dangerous. He's part of our family. When Marcus has his sensory overload episodes, Kodiak brings him his weighted blanket and sits beside him until he feels better. When Sophie has nightmares about her parents dying, Kodiak lets her sleep curled up against him, and she doesn't have bad dreams anymore. She turned to look directly at Janet Morrison. The lady over there says we need professional help and therapy and all kinds of services. But what we really needed was someone who loved us enough to keep us together. Grandma Ellie gave us that. She homeschooled us and taught us how to grow vegetables and preserve food and live off the land. She helped Marcus learn to communicate his needs instead of just melting down. She helped Sophie process her grief through art therapy that she researched and learned herself. She helped me understand that what happened to me in those foster homes wasn't my fault. The courtroom was completely silent now. Several jurors were wiping their eyes, and even Janet Morrison looked uncomfortable. Most importantly, Lily said, her voice now steady and clear, she taught us that families don't have to look like what other people expect. She said love makes a family, not paperwork. And we love each other, all of us, including Kodiak. If you separate us, you'll be destroying the only real family any of us has ever had. Judge Clearwater nodded slowly. Thank you, Lily. You may step down. Marcus was called next, and Rebecca held her breath. The 9-year-old boy had been making excellent progress with his communication skills, but the stress of the courtroom setting could easily trigger a shutdown. Marcus approached the witness stand with visible anxiety, his hands flapping slightly at his sides, a self-regulating behavior that Eleanor had taught the family to recognize and support rather than suppress. "Marcus," Judge Clearwater said in the gentlest voice she could manage, "I know this is scary. You don't have to say much. Can you tell me how you feel about living with Ms. Whitmore?" Marcus looked out at the courtroom, his eyes scanning until they found the window where Kodiak waited in the van. His face relaxed slightly. "Kodiak taught me that it's okay to be different," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Before I lived with Grandma Ellie, people always tried to make me act normal. But Kodiak is different too. He's a bear living with humans, and nobody tries to make him be something else. Grandma Ellie says God makes all kinds of families, and ours just happens to have more fur than most." A ripple of gentle laughter went through the courtroom. Even Judge Clearwater smiled. The other kids at the group home made fun of me because I couldn't talk sometimes, and because loud noises hurt my ears. But Lily and Sophie think my differences are cool. Lily says I notice things other people miss, like when animals are sick or when storms are coming. Sophie says I'm like a superhero with special senses. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. "If you make us live in different places, I'll stop talking again. I know I will, and Sophie will have nightmares, and Lily will think it's her fault because she's the oldest. We need each other. We're a pack, like wolves. If you break up a pack, they all get weak and sad." When Marcus returned to his seat, Judge Clearwater called for a brief recess. Rebecca watched Janet Morrison conferring urgently with her assistants, clearly unsettled by the children's testimony. The emotional impact was undeniable. But Rebecca knew that emotion alone wouldn't be enough to overturn decades of child welfare law. The afternoon session brought Janet Morrison's expert witnesses, child psychologists, social workers, and animal behavior specialists who testified about the dangers of unregulated foster care and wild animal contact. Dr. Michael Brennan, a child psychologist from Denver, painted a picture of inevitable trauma and disaster. These children may appear well-adjusted, Dr. Brennan testified, but they're living in a fantasy situation that cannot be sustained. When reality inevitably intrudes, when the bear's instincts override its training, when Miss Whitmore's advancing age makes caregiving impossible, the psychological damage will be catastrophic. Dr. Amanda Forrester, a wildlife biologist from Colorado State University, presented equally damning testimony about Kodiak. No matter how well trained this animal appears, it remains a wild predator with the capability to kill an adult human in seconds. The risk assessment is clear. It's not a matter of if something will go wrong, but when. But David Crowfeather's cross-examination revealed cracks in their expertise. Neither Dr. Brennan nor Dr. Forrester had actually observed the family in their home environment. Neither had interviewed Eleanor or reviewed her extensive documentation of the children's progress. Their testimony was based entirely on theoretical risks rather than observed reality. The day's final witness changed everything. Dr. Patricia Running Bear had requested permission to present new evidence, a video recording that Eleanor had made just weeks before her medical crisis. "Your Honor," Dr. Running Bear explained, "Eleanor Whitmore was far more prepared for this situation than anyone realized. She made this recording as part of a comprehensive emergency plan for the children's care." The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor's image appeared on the screen set up beside the judge's bench. She sat in her living room, the three children visible in the background working on homework while Kodiak dozed peacefully beside the fireplace. "If you're watching this," Eleanor's recorded voice said clearly, "it means something has happened to me, and you're trying to decide what's best for my children. Yes, my children. Not legally, perhaps, but in every way that matters." Eleanor looked directly into the camera with eyes that held both love and determination. "I know what people will say, a crazy old woman and a dangerous bear raising stolen children, but love doesn't follow rules, and sometimes the most broken families are the strongest ones." The video continued for 20 minutes, showing Eleanor's detailed plans for the children's continued care, her extensive documentation of their progress, and most importantly, her demonstration of the profound bonds that held their unconventional family together. When the recording ended, the courtroom remained completely quiet. Judge Clearwater stared at the blank screen for a long moment before speaking. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning. I need time to consider all the testimony and evidence presented today." As the gallery began to empty, Rebecca felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Janet Morrison, the CPS supervisor who had seemed so confident that morning. "Lieutenant Strongheart," Janet said quietly, "I think we need to talk." The meeting with Janet Morrison took place that evening in a small conference room at the Glacier County Courthouse. Rebecca arrived expecting a plea bargain or settlement discussion. But what she found was a woman whose carefully constructed professional facade was crumbling. "I need to tell you something," Janet said without preamble, her hands trembling as she poured coffee from a thermos. "Something that's going to change everything about this case." Rebecca studied the woman across from her. Janet Morrison had been the picture of bureaucratic confidence in the courtroom, but now she looked haggard and frightened. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her normally perfect hair hung limp around her face. "I'm listening," Rebecca said carefully. "Eleanor Whitmore called my office 14 months ago," Janet began, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wanted to discuss adopting the children legally. She had all the paperwork ready, Character references, financial statements, the complete home study, everything was in order except for one thing. The bear. The bear. Janet nodded. My supervisor at the time, Robert Clark, rejected the application immediately. He said no adoption agency in the state would approve a placement with a large predator on the property regardless of how well-trained or gentle the animal appeared. Rebecca frowned. But that doesn't explain why you're fighting so hard to remove the children now. If Eleanor was trying to work within the system, because Robert Clark is dead, Janet interrupted. Heart attack 6 months ago. And when I took over his caseload, I found something that made me sick to my stomach. Janet opened a manila folder with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be financial records. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she recognized what she was seeing. Clark was selling children, Janet whispered. High-dollar private adoptions to families who couldn't pass legitimate screenings. Wealthy couples who wanted babies but had criminal backgrounds, mental health issues, or substance abuse problems that would disqualify them from legal adoption. He was taking kids from families like Eleanor's, people who couldn't fight back, and placing them with buyers who paid cash. The photographs showed children Rebecca didn't recognize, but the documentation told a horrifying story. Falsified home studies, forged character references, and bank records showing payments of $50,000 to $100,000 per child. 47 children over 5 years, Janet continued. 47 kids who disappeared into private adoptions with no oversight, no follow-up, no protection. I've been trying to track them down since I discovered the files, but some of the paper trails are completely cold. Rebecca felt nauseated. How does this relate to Eleanor's children? Because Eleanor's 3 were supposed to be Clark's final transaction before retirement. He'd already found buyers, a couple in Denver with a history of child abuse, but they had money. Lots of money. When Eleanor refused to give up the children and threatened to expose the whole operation, Clark decided to wait her out. He figured she was old and would die eventually. But she didn't die. No, she got sicker. The Alzheimer's, the heart problems. Clark thought it was just a matter of time before she became incapacitated and he could swoop in. But then he had the heart attack, and I inherited this nightmare. Janet pulled out another document, a letter with Eleanor's precise handwriting. She wrote to me 3 months ago. She knew Clark was corrupt, and she suspected I might be too. She was giving me one chance to do the right thing before she went public with evidence about the trafficking ring. Rebecca read Eleanor's letter, written in the careful script of someone whose hands were beginning to betray her mind. The elderly woman had documented everything: dates, times, phone calls, suspicious transfers of children, financial irregularities. She'd been building a case against the corrupt system for over a year. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just protecting her own children, Janet said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. She was trying to save all the others. She had contacts with investigative journalists, FBI agents, child advocacy groups. If she hadn't had the stroke when she did, Clark's entire operation would have been exposed months ago. So why are you still fighting to remove her children? Janet's voice broke completely. Because I'm scared. If this case goes public, if people start digging into our department's records, they're going to find out about the trafficking. My entire career, everything I've worked for, will be destroyed. Even though I wasn't involved, I was Clark's subordinate. I should have known. I should have stopped it. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, processing the magnitude of what she'd just learned. The custody hearing wasn't about child welfare at all. It was about covering up one of the largest child trafficking operations in Montana's history. How many people know about this? Just me, and now you. Janet wiped her eyes with a tissue. Clark kept everything compartmentalized. He handled the high-dollar cases personally, used different paperwork, different channels. Most of my colleagues thought he was just very selective about placements. What do you want from me? Janet looked up with desperate eyes. "Help me expose this. Help me find those 47 children and bring them home." Eleanor was right. Someone needs to fight for kids who can't fight for themselves, but I can't do it alone, and I can't do it if I'm focused on destroying the one family that Clark never managed to break. Rebecca stared at the photographs scattered across the table, dozens of children's faces, all of them lost in a system that was supposed to protect them. Eleanor had been fighting this battle alone for over a year, armed with nothing but her love for 3 damaged children and an unshakable belief in justice. "What happens in court tomorrow?" "I withdraw the state's objection to the adoption," Janet said firmly. "Eleanor's children stay together. They stay with their guardian family, and we start the real work of finding the ones who weren't so lucky." As Rebecca left the courthouse that night, she felt the weight of Eleanor's true legacy settling on her shoulders. The elderly woman hadn't just saved 3 children, she'd uncovered a corruption that stretched across state lines and affected dozens of families. And now she was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, unable to see her greatest victory. But Eleanor had trained more than just a bear to seek help when needed. She'd trained 3 children to be strong, to fight for each other, and to never give up on love. And somehow, she'd managed to reach across 30 years to remind a forgotten foster daughter that some battles were worth fighting. Tomorrow would bring justice. But tonight, Rebecca sat with the children in Eleanor's hospital room, holding vigil over the woman who had saved them all. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs the next morning when Janet Morrison stood to address Judge Clearwater. The packed gallery, filled with reporters, townspeople, and child welfare advocates who had traveled from across the state, sensed something dramatic was about to unfold. "Your Honor," Janet said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "the state of Montana hereby withdraws its objection to the proposed adoption and requests an immediate investigation into systemic corruption within the Child Protective Services Division." Judge Clearwater's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" The buzz of conversation died instantly. "Ms. Morrison, this is highly unusual. Are you prepared to explain this sudden reversal?" "I am, Your Honor. But first, I must request that this hearing be sealed and that federal authorities be contacted immediately. What I'm about to reveal involves interstate child trafficking and requires FBI intervention." Rebecca felt the children beside her tense with confusion and fear. Lily grabbed her hand, whispering, "What's happening? Are they still going to take us away?" "No, sweetheart," Rebecca whispered back. "I think it's going to be okay." Judge Clearwater called for a closed session, clearing the courtroom of everyone except essential personnel. For the next 2 hours, Janet Morrison laid out the evidence of Robert Clark's trafficking operation, piece by devastating piece. The photographs, financial records, and Eleanor's meticulous documentation painted a picture of corruption that left everyone in the room stunned. David Crowfeather, Eleanor's attorney, sat in shocked silence as he realized the true scope of what his client had been fighting. "Eleanor knew," he said quietly. "She knew about all of this. That's why she was so desperate to formalize the adoption. She wasn't just protecting her own children. She was trying to create a legal precedent that would make it harder for corrupt officials to steal kids from loving homes." The most devastating revelation came when Janet presented Clark's shopping list, a document outlining which children in the system would be easiest to move into illegal adoptions. Eleanor's 3 children were at the top of the list, with notes describing them as high-value placements due to their youth and lack of extended family connections. Lily Chen Morrison was targeted specifically because the insurance settlement from her parents' deaths made her financially attractive to buyers, Janet explained, her voice breaking. Marcus Thompson was considered merchandise because some buyers specifically request special needs children for tax benefits and sympathy. Sophie Williams was marked as premium placement because she was young enough to have no clear memories of her birth parents. Judge Clearwater removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. In 30 years on the bench, she had seen every form of human cruelty. But this systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable children struck her as particularly evil. Ms. Morrison, I commend your courage in bringing this forward. But I need to understand, why didn't you report this the moment you discovered it? Janet's composure finally cracked. Because I was afraid, Your Honor. Afraid of losing my career, afraid of the investigation, afraid that people would think I was involved. But watching those children testify yesterday, seeing their love for Eleanor and for each other, I realized that my fear was nothing compared to what 47 other children have endured because of my silence. The federal authorities arrived within hours. FBI agent Sarah Whitehorse, a specialist in child trafficking cases, took over the investigation with the kind of methodical precision that Eleanor would have admired. Within days, the scope of Clark's operation became clear, and arrest warrants were issued for 12 individuals across 4 states. But while justice ground forward through legal channels, Eleanor remained unconscious in the hospital, unaware that her greatest battle had finally been won. Dr. Patricia Hawkins delivered the news that everyone had been dreading. Eleanor's brain scans showed massive damage from the stroke. Even if she survived, she would likely never recover her cognitive abilities. I'm sorry, Dr. Hawkins told Rebecca and the children in the quiet of Eleanor's hospital room. The damage is too extensive. She may have moments of consciousness, but she won't be the woman you remember. Sophie burst into tears, burying her face against Kodiak's fur. The bear had been granted special permission to visit Eleanor after hospital staff witnessed his remarkable calming effect on both the children and other patients. Marcus sat in stunned silence, rocking slightly as he processed the devastating news. Lily, trying to be strong for her younger siblings, asked the question they were all thinking. What happens to us now? If Grandma Ellie can't take care of us anymore? Rebecca looked around the hospital room, at the children who had become her unexpected family, at the bear who had somehow bridged the gap between human and wild, at the unconscious woman who had taught them all that love could conquer any obstacle. She thought about her own daughter Emma, who had died while Rebecca was at work, pursuing a career that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the family she'd been too afraid to fight for. You stay with me, Rebecca said simply, if you want to. The legal paperwork was complex but not impossible. Eleanor's will, discovered in her attorney's files, had been updated just months before her stroke. She had named Rebecca Strongheart as the children's guardian, along with a letter that explained her reasoning. Rebecca, Eleanor had written in her careful script, I knew you would find your way back to us eventually. Broken hearts have a way of recognizing each other, and yours has been broken long enough. These children need someone who understands loss, but hasn't given up on love. They need someone who will fight for them the way I fought for you 30 years ago. Most importantly, they need someone who understands that families come in all shapes and sizes, including ones with 4 paws and unconditional devotion. The custody transfer was approved with unprecedented speed, helped by the public sympathy generated by the trafficking scandal and the children's compelling testimony. Judge Clearwater signed the orders on a Tuesday morning in December, making Rebecca the legal guardian of 3 children and 1 very unusual therapy animal. But Eleanor's story wasn't over yet. 3 days before Christmas, as Rebecca was reading The Night Before Christmas to the children in Eleanor's hospital room, something extraordinary happened. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she looked directly at her family with clear recognition. "Lily?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lily nearly knocked over her chair, rushing to Eleanor's bedside. "Grandma Ellie! You're awake!" Eleanor's gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in each beloved face. When she saw Kodiak lying beside her bed, she managed a weak smile. "My beautiful boy. You found help, didn't you?" Dr. Hawkins called it a miracle, though she cautioned that Eleanor's recovery would be limited. The stroke had taken much of her memory and most of her physical abilities. She would need full-time care for the rest of her life, but her capacity for love, her ability to recognize her family, and her fierce protective instincts remained intact. The neural pathways associated with deep emotional bonds seem to be functioning, Dr. Hawkins explained. It's extremely rare, but not unheard of. Sometimes love creates connections that survive even massive brain trauma. Eleanor's first coherent conversation was with Rebecca 2 days after Christmas. The children were napping in the hospital family room, exhausted from days of excitement and relief. Kodiak dozed beside Eleanor's bed, his massive head resting on his paws. "I remember you," Eleanor said slowly, each word requiring enormous effort. "Angry little girl. So much pain." Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes. "You saved me. Just like you saved them." "No," Eleanor corrected, her weak hand reaching for Rebecca's. "You saved yourself." "I just showed you it was possible." Eleanor's cognitive abilities would never fully return, but her emotional intelligence remained sharp. Over the following weeks, she became the family's gentle anchor, offering wisdom and comfort even as Rebecca took over the practical responsibilities of raising 3 traumatized children and managing a bear who had become something of a local celebrity. The trafficking investigation led to 43 arrests and the recovery of 31 children who had been sold into illegal adoptions. 16 children were never found, lost in a system that had failed them completely. The scandal rocked Montana's child welfare system and led to federal oversight of adoption procedures across multiple states. Eleanor's role in exposing the corruption made national news, though she was too ill to appreciate her fame. Reporters called her the Guardian Angel of Montana, a title that embarrassed her but pleased the children immensely. "Grandma Ellie was always our guardian angel," Sophie told one persistent journalist. "She just happened to save a lot of other kids, too." As winter deepened into spring, the new family found their rhythm. Rebecca arranged for Eleanor to live in a care facility just 20 minutes from their home, close enough for daily visits but with the medical support she needed. The children adapted to their new school with surprising resilience, though they insisted on homeschooling 2 days a week to maintain the educational approach Eleanor had started. Kodiak became an unofficial therapy animal, visiting nursing homes, hospitals, and schools throughout the region. His gentle nature and remarkable intelligence made him a powerful advocate for both wildlife conservation and animal-assisted therapy programs. But the most profound change was in Rebecca herself. For the first time since Emma's death, she found herself looking forward to the future instead of just surviving the present. She had 3 children who needed her, an elderly woman who loved her like a daughter, and a bear who had taught her that families could be built on love rather than biology. The final piece of Eleanor's plan revealed itself in late spring when her lawyer delivered a sealed envelope that was only to be opened after the adoption was finalized and Eleanor was settled in long-term care. Inside was a single photograph. Rebecca at age 12, standing in Eleanor's garden with dirt on her hands and something approaching happiness on her face. On the back, Eleanor had written, "Full circle. Love always finds its way home." 2 years later, on a golden October afternoon that painted the Montana mountains in shades of amber and crimson, the Strongheart family gathered for their annual picnic beside Mirror Lake. It had become their tradition, a celebration of the day Kodiak had walked into the police station and changed all their lives forever. Rebecca spread the familiar quilt on the grass, the same one that had covered Eleanor's couch during those first terrifying days of uncertainty. Lily, now 14 and taller than Rebecca remembered being at that age, helped unpack the picnic basket while chattering about her upcoming debate tournament. Marcus, 11 and increasingly confident, was showing Sophie how to skip stones across the lake's glassy surface. At 17 skips, his personal record, Sophie squealed with delight and threw her arms around her big brother. Kodiak lounged in the shade of an ancient pine, his massive frame relaxed but alert to every movement of his human family. Age had silvered some of the fur around his muzzle, but his dark eyes remained as intelligent and loving as ever. He wore a special harness today, not restraint, but recognition of his official status as a certified therapy animal, the first of his kind in Montana's history. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair beside the quilt, wrapped in the hand-knitted blanket that the women of Millfield Baptist Church had made for her. The stroke had taken much of her mobility and some of her memories, but her smile remained radiant as she watched the children play. Her speech came slowly now, each word carefully chosen, but her capacity for love seemed infinite. "Rebecca," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying the careful cadence of someone rebuilding language one syllable at a time. "Do you remember what I told you about guardian angels?" Rebecca looked up from arranging sandwiches, following Eleanor's gaze to where the children were now attempting to teach Kodiak to play fetch with a tennis ball. The bear, with infinite patience, would retrieve the ball and gently place it at their feet, never using his teeth, always careful of his enormous strength around the small humans. "You said they come in all different forms," Rebecca replied, "sometimes with 4 paws instead of wings." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I was wrong." Rebecca frowned, concerned that Eleanor was having one of her confused episodes. "What do you mean?" "Angels don't have 4 paws or wings," Eleanor continued, her eyes twinkling with the sharp intelligence that the doctors said shouldn't exist after such massive brain damage. "Angels have badges and brave hearts, and the wisdom to follow, a bear into the forest, when everyone else says it's impossible." Before Rebecca could respond, Sophie came running over with grass stains on her knees and joy radiating from every pore. "Mama Becca, look what Kodiak found." She held up a smooth piece of driftwood shaped roughly like a heart. "He brought it right to me. Uncle David says bears can sense what makes people happy." David Crowfeather, Eleanor's elderly attorney who had become an honorary grandfather to the children, chuckled from his folding chair. "Bears have always been spiritual creatures in our tradition. They represent healing, protection, and the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds." "Speaking of connections," Rebecca said, pulling an official-looking envelope from her bag, "we got some news yesterday that I wanted to share with everyone." The children gathered around as Rebecca opened the letter from the Montana Department of Justice. Over the past 2 years, the investigation into Robert Clark's trafficking ring had expanded far beyond what anyone had imagined. What started as a local corruption case had uncovered a network spanning 12 states and involving hundreds of children. "They found Sarah Matthews," Rebecca announced, her voice thick with emotion. "She was one of the children on Clark's list from 5 years ago. She's alive, and she's been placed with her aunt's family in Oregon." It was the 32nd child recovered from the trafficking network, each reunion a small miracle that validated Eleanor's courage in exposing the corruption. 16 children were still missing, their cases cold, but never forgotten. FBI agent Sarah Whitehorse had promised that the investigation would continue until every child was accounted for. "Grandma Ellie," Lily said, kneeling beside Eleanor's wheelchair, "you saved so many kids. Not just us, but all those others too." Eleanor reached out with a trembling hand to stroke Lily's hair. "We all saved each other. That's what families do." The truth of those words resonated across the lake as Rebecca surveyed the unconventional family that had grown around them. Dr. Patricia Running Bear visited monthly to check on Kodiak and had become a trusted friend. Janet Morrison, who had resigned from CPS to work with a nonprofit organization dedicated to reforming child welfare systems, sent regular updates on legislative changes inspired by Eleanor's Law, new protections for children in state care, and provisions for therapeutic animal placements. Even Martinez, Rebecca's former partner, had been drawn into their extended family circle. He and his wife had struggled with infertility for years before adopting twin boys through the reformed adoption system that Eleanor's case had helped create. "You know," Rebecca said, settling onto the quilt beside Eleanor's wheelchair, "I spent 3 years after Emma died wondering why God would take a perfect little girl and leave me behind. I thought maybe he'd made a mistake, or maybe I was being punished for something." She watched Marcus patiently helping Sophie build a cairn of smooth lake stones while Kodiak supervised with obvious approval. "But then a bear walked into my police station and reminded me that sometimes the most broken people are exactly where they need to be to help fix someone else's broken pieces." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Happy tears, the kind that came when words were too small to contain the fullness of emotion. Emma would be proud of her mama. The mention of Rebecca's first daughter no longer brought the crushing grief that had once made it impossible to speak her name. Emma's memory had been woven into the fabric of their new family, honored rather than forgotten. Sophie had asked to see pictures of her angel sister, and Marcus had created a memory garden in Eleanor's honor where they planted flowers on Emma's birthday each year. As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in watercolors of rose and gold, the family packed up their picnic with the comfortable efficiency of people who belonged together. Kodiak rose from his spot in the shade, stretching his massive frame before padding over to check on each family member in turn, a ritual he performed dozens of times each day. "Kodiak," Sophie said, throwing her arms around the bear's neck in a hug that would have terrified any observer who didn't know their story, "thank you for saving our family." The bear's response was a gentle rumble that might have been contentment or acknowledgement, or simply the sound of a wild creature who had found his place in the world alongside humans who loved him without trying to change him. As they loaded Eleanor's wheelchair into the van and gathered the last of their belongings, Rebecca felt the familiar sensation of gratitude that had become her constant companion. Not the bitter gratitude of someone who had survived tragedy, but the sweet gratitude of someone who had discovered that even the most shattered life could be rebuilt into something beautiful. "Same time next year?" Lily asked, though she already knew the answer. "Same time next year," Rebecca confirmed, looking back at Mirror Lake where their reflections had merged for a few precious hours into the image of a family that shouldn't have existed but did, against all odds and in defiance of every rule about how love was supposed to work. Kodiak took his place in the back of the van, his massive head resting on the seat beside Eleanor's wheelchair. He had walked into a police station 2 years ago seeking help for his family, and in saving them, he had been saved in return. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles began with the simplest act of faith. The faith to follow love wherever it led, even when it wore fur and walked on 4 paws into the most unlikely places. Friends, this story isn't just about a bear who saved a family. It's about the families we create when life breaks our hearts and leaves us wondering if we'll ever feel whole again. How many of us have felt like Eleanor, having lost the people we thought we'd grow old with? How many have felt like Rebecca, carrying grief so heavy it seemed impossible to love again? The beautiful truth is that sometimes our greatest heartbreaks prepare us for our most unexpected blessings. Eleanor lost her husband and son but found 3 children who needed exactly what her wounded heart had to give. Rebecca lost her daughter but discovered that motherhood isn't limited to biology. It lives in every act of protection, every bedtime story, every moment we choose love over fear. At 55, 60, 70, we're not too old to build new families, create fresh purpose, or open our hearts to love that looks nothing like what we planned. Sometimes angels really do have 4 paws, and sometimes the most broken people are exactly who God uses to heal the world. Your story isn't over. It might just be beginning in ways you never imagined possible. What unexpected blessing has entered your life when you least expected it? Have you ever found family in the most unlikely places? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how love surprised you.